The first warning did not arrive as an explosion. It arrived as a low-confidence contact sitting in a queue. At 2:40 a.m. on May 7th, 2026, the USS Farragut, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, patrolled 12 nautical miles east of the Strait of Hormuz. During the patrol, its mine avoidance system detected an unidentified object. The contact was too uncertain to halt the formation, but too risky to ignore. The system marked it for secondary review. The flag waited for a decision. No one in Farragut's Combat Information Center noticed that the same area appeared in 2 other intelligence sources over the past 8 hours. One was a P8A acoustic pass. The other was an overhead anomaly rated low relevance due to a lack of supporting evidence. 3 fragments of accurate warning. No single person had seen all 3 together. 3 US Navy destroyers planned to transit a shipping lane that normally carries a quarter of the world's seaborne oil. During the Hormuz crisis, the lane became a narrow stretch where naval mines, shipping, and politics overlapped. As the review process continued, the contact remained in the queue. The formation advanced. The Strait of Hormuz's narrow lanes matter more than open water, as mines can render even wide straits hazardous. Only the designated transit corridors offer real passage. By May 7, the US was conducting mine clearance under fire and diplomatic strain. Disrupted shipping and rising insurance costs added to crisis uncertainty. Ultimately, shipowners still decided whether to risk passage, even if authorities said the strait was open. The Navy's key problem was immediate and physical. How many mines were in the approaches? Where were they? And how many of them did US mine countermeasures systems actually recognize? The USS Pioneer, an Avenger-class mine countermeasures ship, had spent 4 days at the eastern entrance using underwater mine hunting systems. One, Knifefish, is an unmanned vehicle designed to find and identify mines in clutter, letting sailors stay farther from danger. By 11:18 p.m. the previous night, Pioneer's logs showed that hundreds of seabed contacts were reviewed. Most were debris, clutter, or objects expected in the threat model. Then came Contact 215. Knifefish marked it as ambiguous enough, like a mine to review, but not clear enough for immediate response. The case went into the backlog behind more certain threats. In peacetime, a backlog is just workflow. However, during an active strait transit, a backlog can become a serious navigational problem. The team didn't realize at the time, but the system detected something unlike what the mines analysts expected from Iran, only after the transit. Here is the asymmetry that makes naval mines so dangerous. It takes minutes to lay a mine that might take days, weeks, or months to find. Laying is simple. Clearing a lane is long and difficult. Every anomaly must be found, checked, and, if needed, neutralized. Every false alarm wastes time. Each missed threat puts a ship at risk. Defenders pay for extreme caution, and even more for moving too fast. Hormuz does not have to be officially closed to halt business. Uncertainty alone can make captains, insurers, and governments reconsider. A minefield can disrupt the economy before sinking a ship. Iran has long used mines to slow stronger fleets, force precautions, and highlight gaps between theoretical and actual control. On May 7th, a deeper uncertainty emerged. The threat picture itself may have been incomplete. At 3:12 a.m., by the time Farragut was 7 nautical miles into the transit lane, the bow sonar picture appeared manageable. Based on the routing logic, the earlier low-confidence contact from 240 had drifted out of Farragut's immediate path. That did not make the contact irrelevant. That shift in the contact's path made it particularly relevant to the second ship in the formation. The USS Mason was trailing 1,800 meters behind. The transit plan combined Farragut's and Mason's mine avoidance data to share a common lane picture. Here, that process failed. At 1:55 a.m., the system that shared data between ships failed due to a software error during a relay update. The maintenance log recorded the problem, but it did not warn the watch team. Radios, navigation, and weapons still worked. What failed was the trust that one ship's uncertainty would reach the others in time. By 3:12 a.m., the formation believed it shared one picture, but in reality, they did not. Mason's sonar operator was on his third consecutive watch, watching bottom clutter worsened by wind, traffic, and the busy lane. The ship missed the significance of Farragut's earlier contact. Pioneer's backlog still had not reached the group. At 3:19 a.m., Mason's bow passed directly above contact 215. The mine rose. It did not strike the hull directly. The mine sensors triggered on both magnetic and acoustic signals from Mason. The degaussing system reduced its magnetic signature, ruining a perfect firing solution. Instead of hitting the keel, the mine exploded about 11 meters below. That was enough. The pressure wave struck upward, hitting the ship's underside in less than a second. Sailors in engineering fell. A fuel transfer pump broke loose. Equipment racks are bent. The stern shook so hard that the towed array handling system failed, and the array was lost. The vessel retained propulsion. It could still fight. But it had just been struck in the Strait of Hormuz by a mine whose behavior did not match what the task force expected. For the first minute, no one knew what had happened. The event was logged as an underwater explosion, likely a mine, but still unconfirmed. Farragut slowed. Mason reported damage. Suddenly, the group's understanding of the threat was wrong, and no careful wording could hide it. Post-event analysis pointed to a rising mine profile, suggesting a weapon not in the Hormuz model. Analysts debated whether it meant third-party supply, older transfers, a derivative design, or a misread under combat conditions. Such uncertainty has immediate, far-reaching effects. When a weapon does not match known models, it exposes hidden gaps in threat assumptions and clearance tactics. Officers must not rely on old profiles or standard routines. Unknown or mixed weapons mean predictive systems need updates to track new tactics and supply routes. Future planning should focus on better data sharing, rapid testing of new approaches when contact details are unclear, and flexible responses for new threats. Persistent adaptation is essential. Threat models must stay flexible, and clearance must be ready for surprises. Yet at 3:19 a.m., none of those possibilities mattered. At that point, the formation faced one confirmed detonation and no reliable way to know whether another object with the same unseen risk lay ahead in the lane gap. At 3:22 a.m., Farragut's commanding officer faced a decision that only looked simple from a distance. The transit, with a damaged destroyer behind him, through a contested lane where the mine threat had just exceeded the intelligence model. Alternatively, reversing meant traversing water already considered passed but not truly cleared. It required turning the group around in a narrow lane, all while under observation by Iranian sensors and fast attack boat. Moreover, it meant conceding during a fragile ceasefire that a US naval transit had been halted by a mine strike. On the other hand, pressing forward meant accepting that the best available picture of the lane had just proven incomplete. There was no course of action that could restore certainty. The commanding officer called the higher authority. The guidance was clear but gave little comfort. Proceed if the tactical situation allows. The tactical situation, a damaged ship, an unclassified mine event, an unclear lane, and a data sharing failure that the watch team had only begun to untangle. Farragut's commander pressed forward, not because the risk was low. Stopping in the middle of the strait also carried risks, and none of the higher authorities could give a clear order fast enough to take the decision out of his hands. When higher-ups give only conditional advice, commanding officers turn to decision-making tools such as risk management charts, the concept of commander's intent, and mission command principles. These help them weigh urgent risks against bigger goals, consider both action and inaction, and recognize what they do not know. While doctrine gives a framework, in unclear situations, COs often have to make judgment calls based on their training, the balance of risk to the force and mission, and the need to keep both momentum and safety. Future officers should prepare for these tough choices by learning these schemes, practicing uncertain scenarios, and building the ability to act decisively even when certainty is out of reach. The next 34 minutes were slower than the previous 34, and far more dangerous. The formation slowed down. Farragut's Combat Information Center worked quickly to manually transfer important mine hunting data from Pioneer. Files were sent, contact lists were checked and matched. Operators compared the group's view of what it had seen with what the mine hunters had already recorded. At 3:31 a.m., Contact 215 was recognized as the backlog object that had been retained but not elevated. At 3:35, the team realized the contact had too aligned with Farragut's earlier low-confidence anomaly. At 3:41, an analyst surfaced the P8A pass, which had touched the same water patch hours earlier. The system had not ignored a clear warning. The warning had been spread across 3 different places, but no one had been required to put the pieces together. That is the difference between an intelligence failure and a data integration failure. One means not knowing at all. The other means knowing in pieces that never get combined for a decision. Fixing this problem will take more than just adding sensors or watch standards. Automated cross-checks between platforms, multi-source checks for unclear contacts, and review prompts triggered by patterns in intelligence streams could help ensure these pieces come together before it is too late. Data integration should become a core operational skill, not just something reviewed after the fact, but a regular process that brings scattered warnings together quickly and under pressure. IRGC fast boats approached twice during the slow period. They did not fire. They did not have to. Just being there made every move harder for the formation. A destroyer moving slowly while operators sort out mine contacts is not helpless, but it is exactly where a mine campaign wants it. Less decisive, more cautious, and aware that every extra minute in the lane means more time spent in uncertainty. The formation cleared the Gulf of Oman side at 4:51 a.m. Mason continued under escort. The strait had not closed. It showed how little open really means when you cannot trust what is under the surface. The public story in the first hours centered on the surface exchange: boats, drones, warnings, and claims of ceasefire violations. The underwater event entered official vocabulary more slowly, described first as an underwater detonation under investigation, and only later as a likely mine strike. That delay was not necessarily meant to deceive, it was a sign of the problem itself. A missile leaves a trail. A drone leaves wreckage. A naval mine can wait in silence, explode under a ship, and then leave analysts debating over fragments, sound traces, and the shape of a blast no one actually saw. The politics progressed more quickly than the attribution. The ship reached Bahrain. 3 sailors were treated for minor injuries. Damaged equipment required repair and replacement. But the bigger effect was not the repair bill. It was what naval intelligence had to reconsider. If Contact 215 were a type of threat missing from the current minefield model, then the clearance problem would have just gotten bigger. Every known field now had an unknown edge. Every negotiation over reopening the strait had to consider not just the mines Iran admitted to or denied, but also those that may not fit into anyone's official inventory. The ceasefire problem wasn't simply, will Iran stop contesting Hormuz? It was also, does anyone actually know what remains on the seabed? The insurance world immediately understood the practical version of that problem. Underwriters do not need to know exactly who is to blame before setting insurance prices. They just need to decide if a ship can be insured on terms that make business sense. If a major choke point has confirmed mines, disputed mine counts, uncertain clearance times, and at least one weapon that does not fit the known threat model, the cost of transit changes, even if governments say the lane is technically open. This shift in insurance and commercial risk affects naval planning right away. When shipping costs rise or become less predictable, military planners may need to allocate more resources to mine clearance, expand safe corridors, or adjust convoy schedules to meet market needs. The need to restore commercial confidence can lead to changes in patrols, how assets are used, and public messaging, making the economic impact of mine warfare a key factor in both tactical decisions and wider strategy at sea. This is where the crisis widens beyond the Navy. A shipping lane can be declared open politically, but still be risky for business. War risk insurance might still be available. Some ship owners may still send ships. Governments can offer guarantees or emergency support, but a few ships moving again does not mean things are back to normal. Normal requires predictability. Hormuz did not have it. Mine do not have to sink every ship. They only have to make every ship owner wonder whether theirs is next. The strategic problem is now split into 3 layers. The first was tactical. Find, classify, and neutralize whatever remained in the mined approaches. The second was diplomatic. Secure an agreement that gives mine clearance operations enough operating space to work. The third was epistemic. Determine whether the threat model itself was wrong. That third layer is the one most crisis coverage misses. Reporting on an attack is easy, reporting on the collapse of an assumption is much harder. The assumption before May 7 was not that Hormuz was safe. It clearly was not. The assumption was that the danger could be modeled. Iranian mines, Iranian fast boats, Iranian escalation choices, Iranian concessions. A closed system, difficult, but interpretable. The Mason strike opened the possibility of an open system. A mine no one expected. No one could say for sure where it came from. The list of objects to clear may not match what is actually in the water. In ceasefire talks, the people at the table might not entirely control the dangers left behind. That is how a tactical detonation becomes a strategic problem. Not because one destroyer is hit, because the explosion changes everything you thought you knew about the area. Watch for 3 signals in the weeks ahead. First, watch if the Navy quietly adds more mine countermeasures, unmanned undersea systems, explosive ordnance teams, or special mapping efforts in and around the strait. If you see more of these, it means the strike changed the clearance estimate, even if official statements stay cautious. Officers could also push for regular joint mine countermeasures, exercises that focus on data sharing across platforms, frequent scenario-based training to handle unclear or new mine signatures, and standard procedures requiring multiple sources for high-risk transits. Upgrading fleet data integration tools and setting up automated cross-checks between intelligence, mine hunting, and operational systems would help close the gaps shown by this incident. These steps, along with ongoing reviews of tactics and the creation of quick response teams to combine different warnings, would make tactical adaptation a regular habit instead of just a fix after a crisis. Second, watch the wording of any agreement involving reopening Hormuz. If negotiators insist on third-party verification, international supervision, or technical access beyond Iran's own declarations, that will indicate the problem is no longer simply Iran. Remove your minds. It is, prove the lane contains no surprises we failed to model. Third, watch the insurance language. Not headlines about whether coverage exists, but whether terms normalize, whether exclusions shrink, and whether reinsurers behave as if the risk has become calculable again. Markets are often the first institutions to admit that a choke point is still not truly open. The Strait of Hormuz is 34 kilometers wide. In normal times, about a quarter of the world's seaborne oil passes through it. During the 2026 crisis, it served as a test of whether the world's most important energy route could be blocked not by permanently closing it, but by making people doubt its safety. The Mason did not prove the strait could never reopen. It proved something more subtle. You can clear the mine you find. The mine that changes the war is the one your model never told you to look for.